Thank you, Jessica, and thank you to everyone who's joining us, and thank you especially to our panelists for this discussion, which is going to be amazing tonight. First question to start things off is, what does walking mean to you? And what is your connection or attraction to walking? And then if you can say a little bit about how it all came about for you. We're going to start with Juanita, if that's all right.
Sure. Thank you, Scott. My name is Juanita Metzger, and I'm the owner of Stroll Walking Tours, and very happy to be together with the group this evening. For me, walking has several meanings. Just very quickly, one, it's a very basic function of getting from A to B for me. Because of where I live, very centrally, I can walk to many places very easily and quickly. And because we're made a decision to be a one-car household, and that was actually important about where we decided to live, so that we could keep just one car and walk as often as possible. The other thing for me is just pleasure, an enjoyable activity, and that there are places that you can only get to by walking, and that is really fun to me. That there you can explore in ways that you can't in any other method of travel. And of course, walking whenever I travel is also really important to me. Another meaning is definitely social connection. And I learn a lot about where I'm walking just by observing and paying attention and taking notice of things, and by talking to people. When you're walking, you actually have the opportunity to meet people that you know or cross paths with strangers that you have interesting conversations with, or if you're both observing the same thing. Walking also has a bit of a political meaning for me too. In a world and a city that is increasingly built for cars and auto transportation, the act of walking really as transportation really does feel like a bit of a radical act. And all of this didn't come about overnight, or as a choice to say, I'm going to make the radical act of walking in our city, but it evolved more naturally through a variety of different things. I didn't have a car when I moved to KW in the year 2000. So that's over 20 years. And now, as I mentioned, we're still a one-car household, and so choose to walk as much as possible. And living in an area that's close to both cores, it was a commitment to not having two cars that cemented the walking and cycling. But walking really took hold for me because of work that had been doing for about 20 years, and in the field of social work and primarily community development, and working a lot with neighborhoods. And I would spend a lot of time sitting inside in community centers and meeting rooms, and talking with people and having conversations about what's happening in your neighborhood, and who is involved, and getting people to share about their community. And I started saying to people, let's go for a walk. Can you show me what you're talking about? And can you tell me where this happens? And so I would go on walks with youth, with adults, with families, with multicultural groups. And I could learn more and have a much more engaging conversation in 1 hour of walking than we could in 3 hours sitting in a meeting room. So that really became part of my practice and how I engaged with neighborhoods. And around that time, I also started learning about Jane Jacobs, who is a urban activist and advocate for the role of individuals in how we create cities. And she was a firm believer in walking, and that to really get to know a place, you have to get out and walk. And I also started leading and coordinating Jane's Walk in Waterloo region. And that was another opportunity to have these walking, engaging conversations with people around the cities about topics that were important to them. And it became a really experiential way for people to learn and engage, and felt that walking really helped people to interact, to talk, to connect, and to learn. And now here I am, no longer doing community-based work, but am now operating a walking tour business here in Waterloo region. So it really has been an evolution over the course of many years. And travel has been really important, and have done a lot of walking-based travel in places like Portugal and Norway and Bhutan, and over 100 miles of hiking in Joshua Tree National Park. And so lots of places where you can't get to with a car. So that is how things have sort of evolved, and the importance that walking has meant to me.
Thank you. And if I may, Stroll walking tours has really picked up over the course of the pandemic too, which is no small feat, and I think speaks a lot to the story that you were just telling, and I think says a lot about what Troy and Lorianne are going to be talking about as well. So Troy or Lorianne, one of you want to jump in next about what does walking mean to you, and how did it come to be so important, and where did it start for you? All right, Lorianne, do you want to go? Thank you.
Sure, yeah. So I guess I'm one of those people who sort of thinks that most journeys aren't necessarily about the destination. It's about what you see and what you do on the way to the destination. And walking for a long time was very functional for me. I walk to work. We also are a one-car household. And thankfully, when I had an office job, I was only 10 minutes walk to work. But it wasn't really until 2019, I guess, when I started doing longer distance walks or hikes. I've wanted to walk a Camino for more than 10 years, and I had planned to do it in 2020. And so I started trying to build up my stamina by doing longer hikes, and that's where I started. I walked the length of the Avon Trail, which is about 120 kilometers or so. I did it in different stages. And the idea is that, like, when you're on the Camino, you do 20 kilometers a day, probably at a minimum. And so I needed to be able to do that every day for the length of the. So that was kind of the start of it for me, the Avon Trail. And then I also biked the G2G, the Guelph to Goderich Trail last year. So again, that was kind of trying to build up my stamina. Biking is a whole different thing from walking altogether. When the pandemic hit, I had to cancel my plans for Spain. I was planning to go in 2020. And there wasn't a whole lot we could do at the beginning of the pandemic except to get out and walk around the neighborhood. And that's what I did. We started going as a family, and I just took photos along the way. And just things that I saw. And there's always been kind of a close relationship for me between walking and photography. I always have my iPhone on me. When I was into carrying my DSLR, I would carry it along. But now it's just my iPhone. Every photo I take now practically is on my iPhone. And so that now, actually, I would post those photos on social media, and you know, it got some feedback from people. People like to see them because they were very hyper local. It wasn't always just my neighborhood. It might be, you know, probably within a 10, 15 block radius around the downtown. I live in downtown Kitchener. So that actually has morphed into a program now that I'm running through Mill Courtland Community Center, urban photography program that is completely built around walking around the neighborhood and noticing things as you walk. So I developed a little thing called Urban Intersections. So if you want to look it up on Instagram and or Facebook, that's kind of the umbrella that I'm posting those photos under now. So yeah, there you go. I walk now for all sorts of reasons.
Great, thank you. And if I might interject with a quick question as well, have you found any of those photos being of places like what Juanita was mentioning, places that are not so easily accessible by other means? Like, is there, and with the program, are you seeing that with any of the participants in photos?
Oh yeah, I mean, I ran the program today, and some of my participants are watching this tonight, and I was able to show them. Our theme for this week was nooks and crannies, and so we started out at the community center, and I was able to take them to ends of streets that they hadn't, even though they live in the neighborhood or nearby, they never knew about it or hadn't visited it before. So it did open up the city just a little bit more, I think, for some of the people who attended today.
Great, thank you so much. And Troy, what does walking mean to you, and where did it all start for you?
Well, I have to compliment my fellow panelists on taking up all the answers to this question. So I won't repeat what they said, but I think they've been very articulate in terms of describing how meaningful walking can be, and I share with them a lot of their experiences. The one thing that I will add is that I'm a professor at the University of Waterloo, and I currently am studying neighborhood walking and social connectedness. And so, it has kind of not just a personal meaning to me in terms of the enjoyment that I experienced through walking and the physical activity and the mental health benefits and all this, but also it happens to be a focus of my work currently. So I can get into that later with other questions.
Great, thank you. And good to hear that there is that shared foundation and base between all of you and your experiences, even though you've come at it from all different places and different angles. So our next question is: do you have a favorite route or place or trail? And can you say about why it's your favorite? And I'll open that up to anybody who wants to jump in first.
I'll go. I mostly walk around my neighborhood. I live in Central Frederick in downtown Kitchener. But I have to say that my absolute favorite places to walk in the city are these little alleyways, sort of just above Queen Street. They don't even have names. They run all the way from Victoria, kind of across the, parallel to Queen Street, all the way over to King. They're my favorite place to walk. Sometimes you find little bits of art in there. Sometimes they just have a whole life of their own and lots of grit. And usually there aren't a whole lot of people walking down there either. So it feels like it's a whole other kind of world.
Thank you.
Yeah, maybe I'll go next. Like Lori-Ann, I really enjoy walking in my neighborhood. I'd say that's my favorite place to walk. I think in large part because it's close. I don't need to get there. It's easy to access that landscape. It also connects me to my neighborhood by walking. So I find that it connects me to the landscape, but also, as Juanita mentioned in her opening remarks, I think it really also connects me to my neighbors. I think that's really important, particularly during a time like COVID, where, for much of the pandemic, we've had to isolate. It's given me an opportunity to actually feel more connected. And walking, I think maybe Lorianne mentioned, was one of the few sanctioned activities, certainly at the beginning of the pandemic, in which we could participate. And so I found that it became, if I go back to the very first question, it became particularly meaningful to me to actually get outside and to see other people and enjoy my neighborhood that way.
So not even so much a destination, but more the walk, more being out there, and then specifically connecting with people as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the types of connections that we make on these walks, I don't think we always truly appreciate how important they are in our lives. Because one of the things that I found in my research that really underscores how important walking can be for everyday experiences are those incidental encounters that we have with people that we often don't know, but who are part of our neighborhood landscape or our community landscape. One of the interesting things that's come out of the research that we've been doing is that people, when they're interviewed about their experiences walking the neighborhood, will identify, there's that yellow jacket guy who I see every time I'm walking the neighborhood. They don't know yellow jacket guy's name. They don't even talk to yellow jacket guy, but they nod at him and he becomes part of their landscape. And even though they don't have that sort of strong relationship with yellow jacket guy, if he were to disappear, it would be a loss in terms of their sense of their imagined neighborhood. And so I think these sort of invisible ties, if you will, that we see on our walks are ones that we take for granted. And I think in particular during the pandemic, that's been something that has been missing while we've isolated, is that we don't have those everyday encounters with people that we don't know, but who are familiar strangers.
And was that something that was maybe a bit surprising coming out of the research?
I think we went into it thinking that was one of the things that we wanted to explore. And I would say that was very much an observation that I just made in my own personal experiences. Prior to the pandemic, I would always walk to work. And on my route to work, I would always walk past this halfway house. And every day there was this young man who would be sitting out, probably having a smoke or something. And as I'd walk by, he would wave to me. I don't know who this guy is. I don't know his name. We've never had a conversation, but it became part of my routine that every time I'd see him, he would wave. And like I said earlier, I think I would be really upset if I continued along that route and he disappeared one day. That would be a real psychological loss to me in my neighborhood. And so I think it just underscored for me, and I think my research is also emphasizing this, that those types of connections are ones that we don't really identify or recognize as being as important as they are to belonging to a community.
That's very much in line, I think, with what Juanita and Lorianne have both said, but that idea of, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey, or, in this case, about the walk. It's like a scan of the neighborhood, a check-in, making sure that everything is as it should be, and everybody's in their place. Yeah, it's fascinating. And Lorianne and Juanita, is there anything from your experiences that what Troy's been talking about that you can add in on that, or observations that you've had that complement or similar?
Yeah, definitely. And I would agree with Troy and Lorianne. One of my favorite places to walk is within the neighborhood as well. And over the decades, I've had my offices in Waterloo, but also in Kitchener. And so I would walk through the neighborhood in order to get to work. And after a period of time, I learned to leave maybe 10 or 15 minutes earlier than I needed to, because I knew that I would always run into somebody in the neighborhood and I would always be late for work, because I would have stopped and had a chat and somebody would say, oh, hey, did you read that such and such? Or there would be, a casual conversation or personal conversation or a neighborhood organizing kind of question or conversation. And it was just part of walking in the neighborhood. There are people to talk to. So yeah, that just became a habit of leave earlier because you know that there's going to be somebody to connect with along the way. And I walk in downtown Kitchener a lot, and yet there are regular faces that I see, maybe on different days of the week, and I'll see some other than others. And you look for those people that you maybe haven't seen in a while. And yeah, you have those little bonding experiences with, strangers. I live very close to the Spurline Trail, which is another one of my favorite places to walk. And, there was a person where a small group of us, we watched a hawk tearing apart its lunch one day. And I see those same people since then. And one of them is a huge birder. And so they'll tell me about the other birds that they've seen in the Mount Hope Cemetery and on the trail and at the Stormwater Pond. And, so I learned things from this person that I don't really know their name. But we had this shared experience. And I think that's that power of connection too, that you have these small experiences while you're walking, and those last, and they can carry over into other relationships and ways of connecting.
You've all touched on how walking becomes very quickly so much more than just a means of transportation or exercise. It accomplishes both of those, but then especially when the focus is on community, it very quickly turns into so much more. And so again, from your observations and experiences, can you say a bit more on these social impacts and what you've observed and what experiences you've had?
Sure, I can go take that one. I mentioned that I led Jane's walks for a number of years, and on one of the walks, in one of the first years that I was leading them, a couple came up to me afterwards and said, "We just wanted to tell you we really enjoyed the walk, and we made a really important decision during this walk, just at the end here." And they had emigrated to Canada from Turkey, and the one person of the couple had been in Toronto and moving around to a couple different cities, looking at some places where they might want to settle. And her fiance had just joined her about 6 weeks earlier, and they were deciding where they wanted to live, what city, whether it was going to be Toronto, London, Cambridge, Kitchener. And at the end of the walk, they decided they were living in Kitchener, just because of the engagement and because of the conversation that we had on the Jane's walks. And they liked the energy, they liked the things that people were talking about, the people that they met, who were really interested in their story. And so right then and there, they made a decision that Kitchener is where they wanted to set up their new life. And that has always stuck with me as such a powerful example of that social connection that can come about as the result of walking and walking together with other people. Yeah, and it just reinforced that it's more than just transportation or exercise, but it's about connection. Yeah, that's one of my favorite stories.
I have one too from last July. We had a really big storm through part of our neighborhood, and there were a lot of trees down, really high winds. It was quite frightening, actually. And I suppose the fact that nobody had hydro kind of contributed to the fact that the first thing everybody thought of after the winds had died down and the rain had stopped was to go out for a walk. Went to see the damage, and let me tell you, it was like Old Home Week. There were so many people out just walking around the neighborhood and connecting with each other. And I think also that COVID probably had a big part to play in that response, because we'd all been in lockdown, and we're probably craving some social connection with people who weren't our family members. It just struck me that the first thing people thought of was to go for a walk. And it totally reinforced that whole concept that, walking isn't just for getting from point A to point B. It's also very much a social activity.
Thank you.
I'll tell you though that walking is also about mental health. And I can say, as a parent of 2 teenage daughters, that thank God I have walking in my life, because there are times where I just need to escape their fighting. They just get on each other all the time. And I need to take a breath, go outside, have some time to myself. And so I'm very appreciative that I have a neighborhood in which I can go walking and get that escape.
There's a question that's come up in the Q&A that I think actually fits this, and then fits also the next question that I wanted to ask. And so the question, and I hope I pronounced the first name properly, is it Razi? Who says, I started to walk without my electronics for about twice a week. I still take it on the other 5 days. But what's your experience with this? And so just what you were just saying about the need sometimes to just get out to have some space. So I'd love to hear your thoughts about being plugged in and being unplugged, walking, and yeah.
I always have my phone on me because it's my camera. So I primarily just use it for that. I rarely listen to music or podcasts when I'm walking. There was a time actually at the beginning of the pandemic where I was playing Pokemon Go with my son. And so I would use it for that as well. And I still do that sometimes when I'm out for a walk by myself. But I generally, other than to use it for a camera to take pictures, I'm quite happy to keep it in my pocket and not pull it out.
Yeah, I'm a big podcast listener, so I find that when I'm walking to work, I almost always listen to a podcast. But then during the pandemic, I got into the routine of taking my 2 teenage daughters on a walk routinely in my neighborhood. And of course, because that was more of a social activity, I wouldn't listen to music or headphones or anything like that. But there are times where I want to get out and I want to get a good stroll in, where I get some physical activity. And I think in those instances, listening to music just helps with that activity. So I think it depends really what you're trying to get out of your walk.
Yeah, I don't have any music or listen to podcasts or anything while I'm out walking. Early, at one point, I thought, oh, people listen to music and podcasts when they're walking to work. I should do that. But then I found that I could never get through an episode because I would be stopping to talk to somebody along the way. And so eventually I gave up. I said, this is pointless. I never finish an episode. It's not enjoyable. And I felt like I was missing things in my environment. Walking for me is also about feeling very grounded to where I am and being connected to the land. And so I feel like I feel disconnected from that if I'm plugged in. And I like to just pay attention to what's around me. And usually that means paying attention to traffic at intersections and safety. But yeah, I really just like to observe and see what's happening, see what's changing. There's always so much activity going on a walk, whether it's on a trail, a nature trail, or in a more urban setting. There's always something happening. And so I feel like that captures my attention more than a podcast or music.
And that kind of leads me into the next question that I wanted to ask you. I mean, it's tied to this, but a little separate as well. And so for my part, I'm the new chaplain at Renison College. So I do have the faith and spiritual lens on everything all the time as well. And so I'm curious to hear from you if there is, a spiritual aspect. And I mean, I know just from my own experiences that with walking, being plugged in or unplugged drastically changes how I interact and see with the environment around me. And then also, like you were saying, Troy, it's sort of, when you have an intent for the walk, that also kind of determines or changes what happens. And so is there that component for you? And can you say something about it?
I don't want to barge in here. I actually provided Jessica with some slides because I'm out walking every day, and I notice like everyday ordinary things, and to me, the way the shadows fall on the sidewalk, or it might be the way the mist is rising over a field or something like that. All of those things, I would say, have become a spiritual practice for me. I'm really noticing in a much more sort of slowed down version, how important it is to pause and to notice things. And I notice much more beauty now, I would say, than I did before, or even when I'm walking, with a purpose to get to a certain place. I notice a lot more than I would if I was in a car. Like I would just drive right by these things probably. And I've come to appreciate the moments as I happen upon them. A friend told me that my eye it never stops roving though. So I do seem to be constantly looking for those moments where my attention has been grabbed just by the lighting, or there's something about that vignette that really appeals to me, and it makes me stop and to sort of mentally say, thank you for this moment. It's beautiful, and I'm glad I was here, and I'm glad that I saw this. And sometimes even ugliness can make me stop to do that too. I mean, there's a whole different message that comes out of something that's ugly, like litter on the ground or something like that. But the point for me is that I'm noticing everything, not just the beautiful, like visually beautiful things, because it's all part of life, the good, the bad, the ugly, and so I would say it has become a spiritual practice for me. Maybe sort of laying the groundwork for the really heavy lifting that I'm going to be doing when I'm on my Camino later this year. That sort of inner journey then is going to sort of kickstart into high gear You know, I have no idea what kind of experience I'll have on the Camino, but I'm grateful actually for the pandemic in a way, because it has allowed me to sort of view the world a little bit differently, and only because I've been out walking.
I would totally agree with Lorianne. For me, I would say it's not something that I've, said I'm going to go for a walk to enter into something spiritual. That hasn't been the purpose for me. But like Lorianne, I've found those moments of time where it feels like this is really special. Like, the couple who made a decision to settle in Kitchener because they had this experience together on a walk. And I noticed that with the walking tours that I lead as well, that people are walking maybe in a familiar street or neighborhood or downtown that they walk all the time. But, halfway through, they stop to say, why have I never noticed this? Has this always been here? It's beautiful. Or how did it get here? Why don't we know the history about this? And so people kind of have these moments of, noticing something for the first time, or learning a piece of history or a story about a person in the city's history. And it's a little bit of that light bulb moment. And I've kind of come to realize that it's a little bit, it changes our perspective of how we view things. And we thought something was really boring and there's no history here, but you have this walking tour experience that challenges that perception. And your perspective is different. It's, oh, there are things that I find really curious and I want to know more about them. And so for me, that is kind of the social spiritual aspect, is that it provides a perspective shift. And that, I think, leads to transformation in maybe small or big ways. That I think is really fascinating, and transformation I think has such really strong spiritual connections. And there's also, very long tradition of walking and thinking, walking and creativity, and that walking stimulates those things. It can stimulate deep thinking, it can stimulate, when you're struggling, and it can shift things for you. And so in that way, I experienced that myself in while walking. And I see other people experience that as well.
Thank you very much. And I mean, I think one thing to quickly add is I mean, I think it's all, regardless of what faith tradition somebody might be coming from, the ancient practice of pilgrimage is intensely spiritual. And so every aspect of walking that all of you have described so far, the social interactions, the paying attention to the world around you, having an eye for beauty, having an eye for those things that are jarring and clashing as well. And those are all spiritual experiences and contribute to that transformation, and a variety of different transformations like that couple deciding to settle in Kitchener, and those smaller transformations that allow people to get past blocks, writer's block or whatever it is, and it's not by accident. It's deeply connected within us, and so can any of you say anything more about that transformational impact that walking provides? is there anything else that you've seen or experienced, or that you've heard from others talking to them?
Well, I think one possibility for transformation is related to the social connections that all the panelists have mentioned. What's quite fascinating about walking is that by engaging with our neighbors or with people we encounter on our walks, those relationships have the potential to change and to strengthen over time. They also have there's also the possibility of them weakening and withering if we ignore people. But I think that's quite important in terms of thinking through, if somebody's feeling isolated at home, that there is this potential to go out into your community and go for a walk and possibly build a relationship with other people that over time can actually transform and change into a stronger relationship. So we can move from those invisible ties that I mentioned before, the nodding relationships or familiar strangers, to acquaintances with whom we engage in small talk. But over time, those even have the potential to strengthen to become close friendships, where we invite each other over and we socialize and we come to know each other as friends. So I think that sort of transformation is certainly one possibility that can occur because of walking.
So, transformation that's really at the base of community building and strengthening, creating ties where there weren't ties before, and then building on them. Thank you.
And walking has changed history. You think of large movements over time in history, the civil rights movement, where there have been walks and marches that have really been about changing society and making political change. Think of Gandhi and those walks and marches have been radical political acts, and they've resulted in change throughout history. So I think it definitely transforms from the very small personal and interpersonal level to the macro societal level. And, we look at the Black Lives Matter marches that have happened, and those have been life-changing for people who participated in them, but also as a show of the need for transformation in so many levels and systems. So yeah, I definitely see it as transformational on all levels.
I would add to that, Juanita, that John Muir, who's a naturalist and conservationist, certainly was a walker. And, he had this quote about, he thought he would just go for a walk, but he decided to stay out until sundown because he realized that when you go out for a walk, you're really going in. And so he was speaking to that sort of inner kind of contemplation that he was doing, but then it also led to a movement as well to conserve the natural environment. And he was very key in creating the state park system in the United States. He actually has a connection to Rev'd, Ontario, if you didn't know that. But that also speaks to that larger sort of big picture that came out of the simple act of walking.
As you're speaking, I'm reminded of the huge variety of fundraising events that are based around walking or running to raise funds or raise awareness. Walk a mile in her shoes. The various events around raising funds for cancer research and all of the others as well. And then that walking as political action, and the direct involvement and then impact on people's lives in communities But then I'm also reminded of refugees, and over the last 17 years, I've been involved with refugee resettlement, and should have remembered this before, but all of the times that I've heard stories of individuals, families walking to escape strife and conflict, and that walking then becomes a means to find safety, even relative safety, temporary, and the distances that people have covered walking sometimes are unimaginable, and yet they're able to do it. And I'm also reminded in the midst of that as well is people who whose bodies aren't able to walk, people with disabilities, people who've suffered injuries due to accidents, and so I'm curious as well if any of you had experience with people who are seeking to engage in walking who might be facing some of those limitations, be they physical or otherwise. And do you have anything to say about engaging people with different abilities or people who are disabled?
I think it goes even beyond that, because I mean, we're all talking about walking through our neighborhoods with ease. We never think anything about it. But that's actually not the case for a lot of people, people who are racialized, perhaps. And so there is this flip side to walking, you know, that we might not see. But I sort of have that in the back of my mind when I'm planning my urban photography program, because I don't want it to be just a bunch of white people walking around the neighborhood, because I think there's lots of value just in the activity, and I think by doing it, we're trying to make connections beyond our own little bubbles. That's what I would like to do anyways. I'm not really sure yet how to go about that, but it is a goal for me to partner with some other communities within that neighborhood, so that it feels safer for people who might not feel safe just by virtue of walking around, you know, in a group of people.
Yeah, I think it's important that we remember when we talk about walking, and in particular leisure-oriented walking, that, you know, what's important for people to do so is time, place, and ability. And, you know, when we think about those sorts of things, we can start to think about constraints that prevent people from engaging in these types of activities. So, and when it comes to time, you know, it's one thing to walk during the day, it's another thing to walk at night. I was just speaking with a friend who was complaining that along the Iron Horse Trail, you know, there's in Kitchener, it's lit up at night, but then as soon as you hit the Waterloo border, there's no lights. You know, that's going to prevent a lot of people from engaging in walking at that time of day. And, you know, certainly there's a lot of research on women in particular feeling uncomfortable walking at night. So, you know, time becomes important. Place, I think Lorianne touched on this, but, you know, not everybody has a nice neighborhood in which to walk or nice trails to access. And so I think that became very evident during the pandemic, that, you know, a lot of the populations, the vulnerable populations within our city or cities were probably least likely to be able to access spaces where they could go out and walk, and yet were in most need of those spaces, possibly because they didn't have space in their own homes to you know, have some form of escape from family members and things like that. And then, of course, what you mentioned, Scott, in terms of ability becomes really important, and it's easy to take for granted that, just anybody can go for a walk. And that's just not the case. And if there's any reason why we should be shoveling, or rather having the city clear sidewalks in the winter, it's so that we can enable people to get outside and go for these types of walks. So it gets into a lot of the decisions that we make around planning, around our neighborhoods. I know that there were a couple of questions in the Q&A around, urban planning. I think that becomes really important when it comes, when we start to think about how do we make it more accessible to more people.
I have often noted some elderly people and people walking with canes or walking sticks who are avoiding the icy sidewalks in the winter, and or sidewalks that are in disrepair, or portions of sidewalks in disrepair, and seeing people walking busy with traffic streets where it's less safe.
Well, and think about, sorry to cut you off, Scott, but think about that like in terms of winter. If there's any season where people need to get outside to see other people or to engage in physical activity, it's winter, or the season where we tend to hunker down. So, the city neighbors should be doing everything they can to encourage people to get outside, including shoveling their sidewalks, having the city clear sidewalks, doing whatever it takes to encourage people to get outside.
Yeah, and what we're describing is very much an ableist society, an ableist infrastructure, that if you are able-bodied, in good health, you have no problem walking about in the cities. Mind you, there are very hostile environments with, it's not very pleasant walking along Weber Street, which is 4 lanes wide, very loud, very fast traffic. Even though the sidewalks are pretty wide in some place, not a place I choose to walk. I avoid it whenever I can. And a lot of neighborhoods that are highly dense neighborhoods have a lot of 4-lane major roads going through them. And it's not a very inspiring environment to walk. If you have a family, you're not going very far on your walk. And so are you going to want to walk 20 minutes beside a 4-lane street? Not so much. I also think of the differences in safety for groups of people, that it's less comfortable to walk as a group of youth. There are often suspicions are cast when you see a group of youth walking together, largely unfounded. And I think those kinds of barriers, we tend to think of more in physical infrastructure, but there are a lot of social barriers to people getting out and walking. And a few years ago, I read a book called Trespassing Across America. It was written in the US, and a guy who decided he was going to walk the full length of the Keystone XL pipeline in the United States, from somewhere in the Midwest all the way to Texas. And of course, a lot of that is on private land. And he did a lot of trespassing, as the title of the book indicates. But it got me thinking about public land and private land and what we have access to for walking. And it got me thinking about, the differences in countries. The UK has an incredible system of public byways and paths, and a hugely networked system of walking paths all across the entire countries. That go across public land and private land, and everybody has the right to walk on them. And we have a very different approach to public land and private land, and who has access to what, especially for the purposes of walking. You look at the development of trail systems, the Walter Bean Trail, that goes along the Grand River. There are still sections of it that are broken because there's private land that goes all the way to the river. And so you can't access the river at certain points. You look at other trail areas that have developed over time, bit by bit, piece by piece, as people are able to get together small sections of private land and access. And so that also, I think, is a barrier to walking, is that we're very limited in where we can walk. And in a lot of neighborhoods, it's limited to sidewalks. There are some community trails that go through the neighborhood. But that I also think of as a barrier to the way that we walk.
It's probably important too to mention, like what Juanita said, that people can resist as well. So, she mentioned people, trespassing on land, and I'm not necessarily advocating that people do that, but at the same time, it's interesting to follow desire lines, which, if people are unfamiliar with, are trails that are created by people's use of that space, not because they were actually formalized as trails. So often when you look around the city, keep your eye out for them, but like often there are these pathways that were never meant to be pathways that people just created because that was the way that they wanted to go. So we do see examples of that throughout the city, and that's a great way that people can sort of reclaim space for themselves.
Thank you. And I mean, that gets me thinking again about the transformational aspect, and that, this is especially for those of us who take it for granted, this is learned when we're actually out there seeing these things right in front of us. So that kind of leads into the next question, which is around the role of urban planning in creating a walkable city. And I would add in, based on our conversation as well, like an accessibly walkable city, given everything that everybody said. And so what role do we then as citizens play in advocating for, and when necessary, putting pressure on our governments to make sure that walking and people and the importance of these interactions, the social capital aspect, all of it is included in planning. So it's not just focusing on cars and car culture.
I noticed in the chat, Lynn just identified one of the important ones: public bathrooms. Over the past 2 years, all the public bathrooms have been closed in the downtown areas, and you couldn't access cafe and restaurant bathrooms, even if you were buying something. And so on walking tours, we had no bathrooms to offer people. And so we had to keep our walks a little bit shorter, and really reinforce to people that there is no bathroom access. So please take care of your needs before the walk and or afterwards. So yeah, public bathrooms is one infrastructure kind of idea, and thanks, Lynn, for identifying that.
And just to add to that too, I'm thinking of curb cuts. It's a very simple sort of facet of a sidewalk, but on my street, every curb cut, like if you have a stroller, and I've done this, with my own kids on my street, the curb cuts are so odd. They don't sort of have a level area going up to the driveway. Like it's not, it's like you're up and down and up and down, and you're tilted. And if you have a stroller, like it's very easy to roll right off the sidewalk. People who are on scooters or things like that, sometimes they just go right on the road because it's really quite an unpleasant experience. and when it freezes over too. Those slants in the sidewalk, from the curbs, they ice over and become extremely treacherous. I don't think all sidewalks are made like that. I haven't really noticed it in other areas, but on my street, it's been it's been my bugbear since we moved on to my street, 15 years ago or whatever. But that, to me, that's an accessibility issue as well.
But and it's still an issue, right? Like it's still a problem. It's still there.
Yeah.
The city hasn't come along and said, "Oh, this is a problem. We should fix it." And so, has there? Do you know? Has there been any advocacy or questioning of the city around, "Hey, you should fix this"?
I may have mentioned it once or twice, but the sidewalks were put in new around the time that we moved in, so it'll be a very long time before they get redone. But to my mind, it's like, well, if you're thinking of walking and accessibility and active transportation, that's something that you should think about at the very beginning of planning, not sort of at the end. It's tacked on, well, how do we do these sidewalks? Okay, well, we'll just cut the curbs wherever they fall, right? Because then you're not really thinking about how accessible is this? Is it safe? Especially when there's a grade that allows water to run across the sidewalk, which freezes. So yes, I may have mentioned it once or twice, but not a formal request or anything like that, because I know that nothing will be done anyways, because it's not for any repairs for a long time. So
I actually would like to build on both sets of comments from Juanita and Lorianne. First, Juanita mentioned the lack of bathrooms, and I think it's really important for us to recognize something called defensive architecture. And the idea behind this form of architecture is ways that urban form can be used to deter certain behaviors. Not having a bathroom in an area deters people from using that area for a long period of time. If you look across our urban landscapes, you will find, if you look very closely, that there are lots of things that localities do to, again, deter certain behaviors. Often it's targeted at homeless people or underhoused people and teenagers who loiter. So you'll notice that, for instance, if you're seated on a curb somewhere in, say, the city of Kitchener, you'll see these little strips that are often put on those curbs, and those are to deter skateboarders, for example. These are, again, designed to deter behavior. So I think it's helpful for us to be aware of that. As you're out for a stroll in your neighborhood, look for these things, and let your local elected official know, let the city know that if you think that they should not be there, or if something isn't in place, that it ought to be in place.
Troy,
then, yeah.
I'm not sure, but I kind of think those strips, are you talking about the strips right at the curb with the bubbled?
No, not those ones. I'm thinking about if you're seated on like a curb. I shouldn't have said curb, but if you're seated on sort of a ledge, most buildings in most cities, you'll see these sort of metal strips that are evenly distributed across that area for seating. So you can still sit in that spot, but they deter skateboarders from sliding their skateboards across them. I know what you're talking about, and those are important.
Yes, those
features.
are accessibility.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So thank you for clarifying that. The other thing that I was going to mention, to build on what Lorianne had mentioned, is that she made the comment that what's going to get done, like trying to work with the city, it takes forever. And that's actually given rise to a movement called tactical urbanism. For those who are unfamiliar with that form of urbanism, that's where local residents or urban inhabitants kind of take it upon themselves to make changes to their landscape because they're just sort of, they want to bypass the red tape of government. So for example, if you've got a curb, like Lorianne had mentioned in her neighborhood, you could mobilize your neighbors to actually go and physically change that landscape by maybe actually putting down like concrete to to smooth it out. The city will get really upset, but what they've discovered is that often it points out these problem areas and makes it apparent that they need to do something about it. So, this idea of tactical urbanism is something that more and more people are sort of taking up as a way of addressing shortfalls in our landscape. Another example would be when it comes to biking, if you don't have bike lanes in your neighborhood, you could have a neighborhood initiative where you get together and just paint a line, along the road in your neighborhood. Again, the city might get upset, but it's it's recognizing that there's a movement afoot to see change happen and not to feel frustrated that it's just never going to happen because of bureaucracies through the city.
Jane Jacobs was a big fan of tactical urbanism and about taking action and making action happen. She was also a huge fan of identifying neighborhoods as much smaller than what we actually tend to think of them as. We look at the neighborhoods in our cities, and Lorianne, mentioned Central Frederick. It's a huge neighborhood, and within that neighborhood, what is it? In the center, it's all residential houses. There's nothing else. And if you want to access anything, you have to go to the outer edges of your neighborhood and beyond to other major streets or thoroughfares in order to access your daily needs. Jane Jacobs talked about livable neighborhoods where within a 10 or 15 or 20-minute walk, you can walk to meet your daily needs of a grocery store, a restaurant, a doctor's office, sort of medical needs, a school, some entertainment. And we have shifted away from that so much so that our planning decisions, everything is very separated. So we have residents living here, and we have commerce and commercial areas over here, and they don't mix, but they used to. I live in a neighborhood where, up and down the street, you can identify all of the houses that used to be stores. And, so in my neighborhood, there used to be a greengrocer, used to be a shoe store, a butcher shop, a bakery. Would I love to have that 2 minutes around the corner from my house? Absolutely. And those things encourage more people to walk across the neighborhood to the bakery rather than jumping in the car and driving 15 minutes across the city to a big box store. So one simple thing is the size of our blocks. We have blocks that are so massive in the suburban areas that I wouldn't want to walk either. I wouldn't want to walk one major block to go to a Shoppers Drug Mart or something like that. And it's the street is loud, and it's 4 lanes wide, and it's fast, and I'm probably not going to do it. And this idea of having separate areas, that different functions of our life are in different areas of the city, has changed over the decades. But I think there is some planning movement to shift some of that and have some daily needs type businesses and commerce move back into neighborhoods to reduce that need to drive everywhere. So I hope that trend in planning grows.
Well, I think, to build off of that, I'm really encouraged during the pandemic how there was much more of an effort to create these sorts of temporary landscapes that were much more walkable, more livable, as I think Juanita mentioned. So we saw much more of a willingness to allow restaurants to extend their patios into into parking spaces. We saw cities adding bike lanes, often temporary bike lanes. And so I was encouraged by these changes, but my hope is that we see more of that, and that we learned through that experience about how important it was to engage people locally and to make our neighborhoods more livable. So, I would be really, I guess, discouraged if a lot of these efforts just go back to the way things were pre-pandemic. I think we learned a lot during the pandemic about how important sociability is, and encouraging that type of interaction through the way that we engaged with space.
Mm-hmm. I would agree. Picking up on the suburban sort of layout. I mean, you have to just look at any house on any street in the suburbs, and the first thing you see is the bridge. So the car there is the connection. That's what gets you from point. There's no human connection there, but contrast that to my neighborhood, for example, and it's the porch that you see first thing, right? So I spend a lot of time on the porch, especially in the summer. I'm quite high up above the sidewalk, but I have no problem sort of hanging over the edge of the of the porch and talking to people who are passing by on the street. It's to me that's design around a human connection. And yes, I'm hoping that in some of the newer suburbs, I think there may be a bit of a movement to have bigger porches and garages that recede, perhaps. But I was thinking about in the City of London in UK, they have something called, it's actually an environmental charge for vehicles passing through the center of London. So it's called a congestion charge. But the center of London is heavily pedestrianized. There are always masses of people there. But the congestion charge is a deterrent to drivers to go into that zone. Costs about $25 if you want to enter the zone. So I was thinking about how, would something like that work here? It's not the same, it's not sort of specifically walking oriented, but I think it would encourage people to walk a lot more. If this congestion charge perhaps went into public transit and made public transit free for people, so that they're able to come into the center of town and walk around and not have to negotiate with traffic or 4-lane highways and things like that. So I think there are ways we could sort of maybe think differently, but it can't be just sort of a city-wide initiative or one city in our region. I think it needs to have a regional lens, because public transit is a regional thing, and cities want to be walkable. So, I think there could be some creativity and innovation there. Completely different market in North America. It would be a hard sell, but definitely worth thinking about.
Thank you. And just trying to watch the time, and want to make sure that we have time for questions. But I did want to say, I know that in the case of London, UK, there's with that congestion charge, and then at the same time trying to work on pedestrian life and walking, that there's also huge health impacts on the citizens who live in that area, respiratory conditions and illnesses in children, schools, and it's a major issue. So in that case, it's that charge is essentially trying to offset healthcare system responses, and it's very much a response rather than proactive. And so I would think that we have the opportunity to be proactive so that it doesn't get that bad where we are. And so question then sort of related back to all of these concerns, is it fair to say that in whatever way we can, as citizens, finding ways to voice concerns and to participate in advocacy to elected officials, and also maybe conspiring to partake in some tactical urbanism to improve our neighborhoods and make them better and more accessible for all. But any last thoughts about that advocacy piece, about what to do to make things better?
Well, we do have elected officials that we can contact at any time with some of these concerns. I don't know how many people actually do that, but certainly ward councillors are there to, you know, be accountable for specific changes.
Yeah, I think you know, definitely we should all have a voice when it comes to you know, encouraging government to respond to our you know, preferences, desires, or you know, what we need to see in terms of changes to our neighborhoods, our landscapes. One of the challenging things with that, though, is that, you know, the squeaky wheel gets the grease, to be sure. But, you know, often it's the vulnerable populations that need these changes the most and have the least voice when it comes to making those changes. So somehow, like, I think that we need to just recognize that often, you know, we engage in NIMBYism, you know, the idea of not in my backyard, that we, you know, that sometimes we advocate for our own neighborhoods when other neighborhoods need those sorts of resources. So, you know, I'm not sure what the answer is to that. I think I would hope that elected officials would be really sensitive to that, and you know, make sure that they put that effort into addressing issues in other neighborhoods, not just the ones that are going to be so vocal about them. But I'm afraid that I'm not sure that's how things actually work in practice.
Thank you very much. Sorry, were you going to say something, Winnie?
Take them on a walk. In Jane's walks from years past, I've had, there've always been city councillors, regional councillors who have joined walks. And because it's an experiential way of understanding what neighbors and residents are trying to communicate in a very concrete, tangible way. So I think anytime that we can focus on a collaborative opportunity where residents and neighbors have a more direct or a stronger voice than just filling out a survey or speaking up as a delegate at a council meeting, but that citizens have a very active role in being able to advise solutions that happen. Because often it can feel like residents communicate things and they feel like it's going into a black box and that it's not heard, and what the plans that are made are often not, you know, not reflecting the concerns that people have communicated. So I think we can work towards more collaborative opportunities where residents and neighbors have a more direct say in how things get implemented. In our neighborhood, that's happening right now with a neighborhood park. And there's been very much a collaborative process in how the area residents use that space their vision for it, and the actual plan that has been put in place has very much reflected that. And it's been very accountable to what the neighborhood and community has wanted to be able to do. That's one small example, but I think that can be scaled to lots of other areas. The cycling community in Waterloo region, I think, is doing a fantastic job at being very collaborative and engaging, and also pushing for better and better facilities and infrastructure. And I think I think it's happening in other ways as well, but in small pockets around accessibility and community advisory committees in other areas for the city and the region. But is it all connected together overall? I don't think so. But it's definitely come a long way than where it was even just 20 years ago.
I think we'd be remiss to also mention or not mention that the region and the cities also have an official plan, and so these the consultations that happen around the official plans, that's really when citizens need to be engaged. So if they want to have a much more walkable or active transportation, a lot more active transportation routes sort of built into the plan, then they need to go to the consultations around the plan at the very beginning, because everything else that the city does, all the urban planning that the city does, is built off of that plan. And it's updated every 10 years, something like that. Sorry, former city employee. I had to give a plug.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all. I've done a terrible job of keeping us on time, but I hope that we've also answered some of the questions, and even in the short time that remains, I think that we can actually cover the questions that have been asked. So again, just really quickly, thank you, Troy, thank you, Juanita, thank you, Lorianne, and thank you to all of the people attending tonight. So we've covered a lot, some really important things, and I know that you could talk so much more, and that there's so much more to talk about. So coming back from some of those heavier things to a little bit lighter, although just before we do that, I did want to highlight a comment that one of the participants had made. Henriette had said to remember as well about long walks for Indigenous justice by Indigenous peoples from Northern Ontario to Ottawa along the Grand River every summer, the All Nations Grand River Water Walk, led by Marianne Kabayosai.
Sorry, it's Calabosi.
Thank you. Part my eyes. Sorry. Thank you. So yeah, also really important to remember all that is going on in the ways in which Indigenous communities have raised issues through walking. Now, Henriette also asked a question which works well with another question asked by Ali, and that is, can you describe any interesting non-human or natural encounters or observations you've had while on your urban walks? And then Ali asks, do you find that your walks have led you to hold more appreciation for our environment and other living beings? What is something in the environment that brings you joy now that you hadn't recognized before?
The foxes. During the pandemic, the foxes have re-established themselves closer to some urban areas, and it's just been really wonderful having encounters with them at a distance, and seeing them around the neighborhood. I also mentioned the large hawk that is was having lunch one day along the Spurline Trail, and I live between the Mount Hope Cemetery and the Spurline Trail. And the Spurline Trail is quite open, so there are a lot, often, birds of prey that are also doing their route along the Spurline Trail, looking for their lunches, and can see the birds of prey sort of going between the cemetery and the Spurline Trail. Yes, for me, it's been the foxes, and I love watching the birds of prey between their habitats, and there's lots available for them in the neighborhood.
We got a puppy during the past year, and if you're talking about non-human interactions, our dog does not walk terribly nicely on a leash, and is very reactive to other dogs. So what I find is that we are taking new paths, because if I spy a dog down the street, then I need to avoid it. So the whole adding a dog into the walk has completely changed my walking experience.
Yeah, and to take it in a bit of a different direction, one of the things that I've really enjoyed about walking is the way I come across surprising features of the landscape. I think Lori-Ann mentioned this, where she might come across a piece of art, or something that somebody's done to their property, or the little library boxes that you see in your neighborhood. These types of ways of animating space in our neighborhoods, in my view, kind of add quirky features or whimsical features that make the walk really interesting. So I've really enjoyed that, and I would encourage people to think about what they can do with their own properties to make them quirky or whimsical, and attract people to people's attention as they walk by.
I'm lucky to live in an area where I have access to a lot of public art, really large pieces, sculptures, wall murals, but it's also, I walk amongst that art almost every day. But I think it's the little, just what Troy was saying, the little sort of odd things. People are really, really creative in their front yards, and I've really come to appreciate that. I think some of it was a response to COVID. It was just a way to sort of brighten, like sidewalk chalk was really big for a while. But it stayed, it stuck. And I mean, I could tell you about one front yard that has a whole series of mini sculptures made out of stones. There's like elephants and dogs and all sorts of really neat things, and they're all just about this high, populated all around her house. And I see something new every time I go by it.
I love that Robin mentioned in the chat that she carried chalk with on her walks and left messages for people on their driveways. I think that's awesome. Like, that sort of thing is really cool. And I think that there's so many creative things that people can do. Perhaps the pandemic has encouraged people to think about them, but I would certainly hope to see more of that in the future.
Thank you.
Oh, and sorry, just one more thing. The thing I really, really have grown to appreciate, especially over the last 2 years, is our urban forest. Just the amazing number of trees that we have, trees and bushes. Certainly in my neighborhood, I know a lot of neighborhoods don't have as many trees. They may have some planted, but you don't have the benefit yet of the big mature trees. But just walking through all of the different seasons and seeing how one tree can change has just been really, really cool. And
people's gardens are pretty amazing. And as a gardener, I encourage everyone to compliment gardeners in your neighborhood because we really appreciate it.
Thank you all. And the two remaining questions in the Q&A are, I mean, one we've sort of touched on in terms of, and again, I'm hoping that I'm pronouncing this correctly, Hulain, asking why Kitchener maintains and develops the Iron Horse Trail, and then Waterloo treats it so poorly. Certainly an interesting question, and coming back to that advocacy piece and following up with elected officials, maybe something where a few more voices could be asking the same questions and pursuing some of those issues that make it safer in one spot and less safe in another. And then Hulain also asks if mentioning research on walking by Shane O'Mara, and mentions specifically In Praise of Walking is his recent book. So I assume it's commending his research on walking. So thank you for that. Certainly something we can all look into. Thank you again. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully we've left people wanting more and also inspired to get out and do more walking, and then also asking those really important questions around accessibility and inclusivity, and making walking accessible for all. So again, my thanks to you, and thanks for the opportunity to moderate and be with you.